So let's keep reading. God's glory in ancient Israel. Again, we're talking about the sign of Christ's coming and the brilliance that accompanies that as the glory of the Lord that was spoken about in the Old Testament. Van Kampen continues, further evidence that the sign of Christ's coming is the supernatural manifestation of God's glory is found in the scriptural history of Israel. From the time the tabernacle was built under the direction of Moses until an unspecified time later, probably just prior to the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC that I just spoke about earlier, God's glory was present in the tabernacle and later in the temple. And I alluded to this earlier, but now we're going to read about it. This is Ezekiel's recording of the glory of the Lord that departs and then is going to eventually return. Let's read Van Kampen. This glory of God was present in a way that was unique, i.e. localized and restricted, and by its very nature beyond human understanding. Moreover, Van Kampen records, God's glory was not visible even to the high priests, because to have beheld his glory would have been to die, right? Exodus 33, verse 20. So we know that we're talking about the glory that was localized over the Ark of the Covenant, right? The mercy seat, and the priests went into that location only once a year during Yom Kippur. And even then there was thick smoke and the incense was burning and it was dark. There were no menorah lamps on that side of the veil where the Ark of the Covenant was, so they weren't looking at anything. It was darkness and there was smoke, even if there was any light that was coming from the menorahs on the other side of the curtain, which likely there wasn't because of the thickness of the curtains. Point being, they were in complete darkness when they were splashing the blood on the four horns of the mercy seat, the four corners, when they were dashing the blood. So they didn't see anything. The glory of the Lord was there, and yet they couldn't behold it. So it's almost like an oxymoron or a paradox. The glory and the brilliance of the Lord was shrouded in darkness. Even we read earlier in the book of Psalms that it says, clouds and thick darkness surround him. I've often kind of just marveled at the descriptions of God. You know, he dwells in unapproachable light, and yet he dwells in thick darkness. You know, where's the light stop and where does the darkness begin? Where does the darkness stop and where does the light begin? I mean, God is light, and Yeshua is the brilliance of God, right? So we're talking about the themes of light and brightness and fire, and yet at the same time, their descriptions of God is cloudy and thick darkness surrounding him. So it's a mystery, right? How does that factor in? How is he simultaneously in darkness and in light? How is his glory both brilliant and yet something that man can't approach? Okay, so just think about that for a moment. The prophet Ezekiel had the heart-rendering task of reporting the departure of God's glory from the temple because of the continued and unrepentant sinfulness of Israel. In his vision of the four wheels, Ezekiel witnessed the glory of the Lord going, quote, up from the cherub to the threshold of the temple, and the temple was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. So we got those two themes again. We got clouds, and then yet we have brightness, right? Are they bright clouds? Are they dark clouds? You know, don't think too hard about that. So that's Ezekiel 10:4. But the glory, Ezekiel says, continued to move farther away as it departed. We're on page 302 of Van Kampen's book, The Sign. As it departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. That's what we're talking about, the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant. And then, when the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings and rose from the earth in my sight with the wheels beside them, and they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house. Moving with the cherubim, right? So we're not just talking about the Ark of the Covenant, but we're talking about physical cherubim now. Moving with the cherubim, the glory of the God of Israel, now hovering with them over the east gate, still farther from its original dwelling place, right? Ezekiel 10, 18, and 19. And then finally, Ezekiel records that the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel still hovered over them, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain, which is east of the city. So it's like he's moving away from the temple, moving in a direction of the east, and he's pausing at certain places to kind of stop and reflect on the disappointment of Israel's rejection of God and the glory of the Lord being personified here is moving in stages away from the temple in a direction going east. And then at that point, Ezekiel's vision ended, and we can safely assume, Van Kampen says, that the glory ascended from the Mount of Olives, i.e. the mountain which is east of the city, to heaven from which it came. He continues, Ezekiel later had the privilege of also predicting the return of God's glory to earth. So now we're talking about an event that hasn't taken place yet. Ezekiel's given a supernatural tour, as it were, of the restored temple, which isn't here yet. A temple which I believe, given the dimensions of the temple that have never been witnessed by humans, I believe this is the description of the millennial temple that Yeshua himself will oversee, or in fact build supernaturally. Could be one or the other. But it's certainly not to be confused with the interim temple or the Antichrist temple or the tribulation temple that will be defiled by the Antichrist at the midpoint of the week. Whether it's a full-blown temple, we don't know, or whether it's simply some small tabernacle-like structure, tent of meeting like we had in the Old Testament, that Moses went to meet with God at the tent of meeting, what we call in Hebrew the Ohel Moed, tent of appointment, literally in the Hebrew, the Hebrew word suggests. Well, it could be that, and this allows for a mercy seat that exists in that small tent from where there's an altar and a mercy seat, an altar on the outside of the temple, an altar on the outside of the tent, and then a mercy seat on the inside where God's glory resides, just like it did in the Old Testament. And yet the altar on the outside will be used for animal sacrifices, and then the altar on the inside will be for the Yom Kippur sacrifice. So there's two altars, one on the outer, what the book of Hebrews calls the outer and the inner portions of this arrangement. The outer outer altar for the daily sacrifices and the ones that people bring for their various sin offerings, and then the inner one, which was reserved only for the Yom Kippur offering. Point I'm trying to make is that arrangement, whether it be a very small tent of meeting structure or be a large full-blown temple that the Dome of the Rock has allowed to exist, which, I mean, the Arab powers that are going to have to really be bent over backwards to allow that to happen. But that's going to be defiled by Antichrist. It'll be defiled at the midpoint of the week. That's not what Ezekiel's saying, all right? Ezekiel's description should be something much, much larger than we've ever seen on planet Earth. So that kind of corresponds with the millennial temple. It seems to make sense there. And another factor of Ezekiel's temple is that the glory of the Lord, as we're going to read here in a moment, will have returned by that point in time and will take up residence locally like he did in the time period during Moshe, right? When Israel had the glory of the Lord and they were able to interact with it. So let's read this account. This is all within the context of this glory of the Lord accompanying the rapture and splitting the eastern sky with the brilliance of Christ's return to gather his saints. So we're still within the larger context of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, the return of Yeshua, the sign of the end of the age and of Yeshua's return. Let's read Ezekiel. Ezekiel later had the privilege of also predicting the return of God's glory to earth. Ezekiel's given a supernatural tour, as it were, of the restored temple. After an extensive tour of the temple, Ezekiel reports that he was led to the gate facing toward the east, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east. And his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. Ezekiel 43, 1 and 2, emphasis added by Van Kampen. I believe this event that we're seeing here is not the rapture, but is instead at the end of the week, at the end of the 70th week, at the end of the tribulation period, after the Battle of Armageddon. Yeshua returns, defeats the Antichrist with the armies of heaven, which includes us, riding on white horses with him. He defeats the Antichrist and the false prophet, pitches them and tosses them alive into the lake of fire, and then draws the nations into the valley of decision, Jehoshaphat, to do the sheep and goat judgments and determine who's going to actually enter into the millennial kingdom and rule and reign with him. And so we have the establishment of the millennial kingdom along with the millennial temple that gets rebuilt, I believe supernaturally by Yeshua. Based on the dimensions of the temple, it's probably something that he will build or oversee at the very least. So this occurrence that Ezekiel's describing, where the glory of God returns from the way of the east and comes through the gate facing the Mount of Olives, exactly the return of, in other words, it's the opposite of the way the Spirit left earlier in Ezekiel. So he left through the east gate, and now he's going to return back from the east. Well, this seems to correspond with the end of the 7th week. Van Kampen continues, it becomes quickly evident that the Lord's glory will return in exactly the reverse order and path by which it departed. It will return first when Christ is revealed at the second coming, and later when he returns to rule over Israel. So you see the two events kind of split apart by the rapture as Christ's second coming, and then when when Christ rules over Israel at the millennial time period. The prophet goes on to say that the glory of the Lord came into the house, i.e. the temple. Again, this is not the Antichrist temple that gets defiled. Why would the glory of the Lord come into that thing? Rather, I think that thing's basically a temporary. It's going to get wiped out. It's going to get destroyed in the aftermath, and in the when Israel is just absolutely split in half, and practically destroyed by the earthquakes and things like that. It's a disposable temple. But Van Kampen talks about how that the prophet goes on to say that the glory of the Lord came into the house, i.e. the temple, i.e. Ezekiel's temple, the one that Yeshua is going to occupy, by way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord. We're talking about the brilliance of God himself, which is Yeshua. The glory of the Lord filled the house. Verse 4 and 5, emphasis added. And so the glory will return from the way of the east, and the earth will shine with his glory. And then the glory of the Lord will come into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. Verses, emphasis added. Van Kampen continues as we're winding our study down in these last 10 minutes. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus, now we're coming full circle again with the Matthew passages, Jesus clearly described those two separate glorious events. First, just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. So that's verse 27 of Matthew, along with verse 30 tacked on to the end. If you put the two together, 27, and then jump over to 30 real quick and skip to the two verses in the middle. So Van Kampen reminds us that this glorious coming of Christ from the east will initiate the day of the Lord. Let me show you that chart one more time. We can see it here with the sixth seal down at the bottom of your screen, signs in the sky, right? That John recorded in the book of Revelation. But this corresponds with the arrow on the top that says coming of the Son of Man, date unknown. But notice the blue section called the Great Trib. See that right there near the middle, but slightly to the right? The Great Trib in the blue is cut short by the yellow part of the arrow that says Day of the Lord, with the seventh seal, the trumpets, and the bowls. Well, that's what Van Kampen's talking about. The rapture and the commencement of the Day of the Lord should be back-to-back events, possibly even on the same day. Seen from a different chart, it's the two arrows that are kissing each other. The pre-wrath rapture, the white arrow pointing up. The second coming, the black arrow pointing down. Second coming there being the second coming of Messiah, initiated by the rapture first, not to be confused with his physical return to planet Earth later on the farthest right of the chart, at the end of that part that says God's wrath, Day of the Lord. So God's wrath and the rapture are back-to-back events. We have this here on this chart where we have the number 6, which is the cosmic disturbance, right? The darkness that surrounds planet Earth because of the sun, moon, and stars losing their light, coupled back to back with the day of the Lord, with number 7, the trumpet judgments that are poured out as 6 and 7 seals commence chronologically. So the great tribulation is cut short by the day of the Lord. And then if we zoom in a little bit on that, 6 and 7, we see the cosmic disturbances at the beginning of this event, this kind of mini slice of events, and then the apostasy of man and sin being part of those convergences. I'm not saying that things have to happen all exactly the way they're lined up in this chart. Can we know for sure with 100% certainty that these are the way these are the order? No. But what we are certain is that the 6th seal is a description of the supernatural darkness, and then the day of the Lord is commences with this brightness or glory of the Lord that is going to be seen by everyone. Let's keep reading Van Kampen here. Second, in a latter part of the Olivet Discourse, Christ explains to his disciples that when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Matthew 25:31, emphasis added. And he's going to rule over Israel. So the glorious coming of Christ described in this passage, which occurs after his coming to initiate the day of the Lord, will occur on the first day of the millennium. So don't get confused, thus confirming Ezekiel's prophecy concerning the future return of God's glory. So don't get confused when we're talking about this return of Christ and the glory that will accompany him. We've got a preview of it at the rapture with the glory of Christ piercing the darkness caused by the 6th seal, and then he raptures the saints up to be with him in the air. But then planet Earth is thrust into the melting pot known as the day of the Lord, with all of its judgment from the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. And we are excluded from that as believers. The wrath of God and the wrath of the Lamb that are poured out upon wicked, unrepentant, sinful humanity, along with the Antichrist and his beast kingdom. So we'll be exempt from that. But the glory accompanying the rapture is that first glimpse or witness of the glory of the Lord from humanity, from their perspective, only to be seen as the glory of the Lord later on when he returns to establish his kingdom and set up his 1,000-year rule. So we're drawing this part of our study to a close. We're about 5 minutes out. Let's keep reading. Let me see. The glorious return of Christ retired. You know what? This is actually a great place to stop. We can stop a little bit early because now the Van Kampen is going to talk about your redemption draweth nigh. And we're still talking about the glory of the Lord. This is kind of an excursus on this aspect. We're going to begin to look at when the glory of the Lord pierces the darkness and the accompanying rapture event takes place. Will the world be expecting this? No. This is why they are living like in the darkness, like Paul describes as a thief in the night. The return of Yeshua will be like a thief in the night because they are dwelling in darkness, living in darkness. And yet we believers are not children of the dark. We're children of the light because of the light of Messiah that is in us and because of the Holy Spirit that is active and alive within us. So we're going to begin to talk about how that the day of the Lord spoken about in the Tanakh is on the one hand a day of doom and gloom and judgment for the wicked humans, the earth dwellers that are alive during that time, and yet at the same time, simultaneously, it is a day of rejoicing for those of us who are believers, because it is the day that signals our redemption, which is drawing closer, drawing nigh. So we're going to stop right here with just a few minutes early because I don't want to jump into this topic, and we'll pick this up next week with your redemption draweth nigh. But that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.